At 1800 on June 2nd, 1944, German reconnaissance pilots flew low over the fields of southeastern England, cameras clicking, documenting what they saw below. Hundreds of tanks, dozens of landing craft, massive fuel depots, artillery batteries positioned in neat rows, an entire army preparing for invasion. The pilots returned to their bases and reported what every German commander feared most. The Allies were massing forces directly across from Pas-de-Calais, the shortest route to France. The invasion would come there. It had to. Except none of it was real. The tanks were rubber balloons. The landing craft were painted canvas stretched over wooden frames. The fuel depots were empty drums. The artillery pieces were telephone poles with sheet metal welded into gun shapes. And the entire deception was being orchestrated by a unit that didn't officially exist. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, also known as the Ghost Army. This is the story of how 1,100 American soldiers used inflatable tanks, sound effects, fake radio transmissions, and theatrical performance to fool the German military for nearly a year. How artists and designers became soldiers, how sound engineers became weapons, and how the greatest deception in military history helped win World War II while remaining classified for 50 years. The Ghost Army was born in January 1944 in a conference room in London. Allied planners were finalizing Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. The strategic problem was brutal. The Germans had 60 divisions in France. The Allies would land with 8. Success depended entirely on deception. The Germans had to believe the invasion was coming somewhere else, and they had to keep believing it even after the real landings began. The solution required a new kind of warfare. Not firepower, not manpower. Deception power. Make the Germans see armies that didn't exist. Make them hear tanks that weren't there. Make them intercept radio messages from units that were pure fiction. The British had been practicing tactical deception in North Africa with some success. But nothing on the scale the Allies needed had ever been attempted. The man who would make it happen was Colonel Hilton Howell Rayleigh, though he would soon be replaced by Colonel Harry Reeder. The mission parameters were simple and impossible. Create a unit that could impersonate entire divisions, make the deception mobile so it could operate anywhere across Europe, and do it with roughly 100 men instead of the 15,000 soldiers an actual combat division required. The U.S. Army started recruiting in early 1944, but they weren't looking for infantry. They were looking for artists, sound engineers, actors, set designers, radio operators with creative minds. Men who could think laterally, improvise, and sell an illusion under pressure. Recruitment officers visited art schools, advertising agencies, radio stations, and theater companies. The pitch was vague: special assignment, creative skills required, details classified. By April 1944, the Ghost Army had assembled at Camp Forest in Tennessee. What they found when they arrived confused them. No combat training, no weapons drills. Instead, they were issued technical equipment most soldiers had never seen. Inflatable tanks that came in duffel bags, sound trucks equipped with massive speakers and wire recorders, spools of recordings, tank engines, truck convoys, bridge-building equipment, soldiers talking, and radio sets with instructions to transmit fake messages following carefully written scripts. The unit was divided into 4 specialized groups. The 603rd Camouflage Engineers handled the visual deception, inflatable tanks, fake artillery, dummy landing craft, and phony structures. The 3132nd Signal Service Company Special handled sonic deception, playing recorded sounds of military operations through speakers that could be heard for 15 miles. The Signal Company Special handled radio deception, transmitting fake communications to create the signature of entire divisions. And the 406th Combat Engineers provided security and support. The visual deception equipment was unlike anything the military had used before. The inflatable tanks were made of rubberized canvas, weighed 85 pounds deflated, and could be inflated by 4 men using a hand pump in 15 minutes. A Sherman tank normally weighed 33 tons. The inflatable version weighed less than some of the soldiers, but from 200 feet away or from the air, they looked real. Shadows were painted on. Treads were sculpted into the rubber. Turrets rotated. The soldiers learned to treat the inflatables like real tanks. They positioned them in tactical formations. They created fake tread marks in the mud by dragging logs behind jeeps. They parked jeeps next to the inflatables so aerial photos would show the correct vehicle-to-support ratio. They even learned to walk around the inflatables carefully, the way real tank crews would, because German observers might be watching through binoculars from miles away. The sonic deception was even more sophisticated. Engineers had recorded actual military operations, M4 Sherman tanks moving in formation, supply trucks on dirt roads, pontoon bridges being assembled, soldiers shouting orders. These recordings were played through custom speakers mounted on half-tracks. The speakers were directional and powerful. A single truck could project the sound of a 30-tank column moving through the countryside. German listening posts would hear it, triangulate the position, and report enemy armor movement. But the real genius was in the layering. The sonic engineers didn't just play tank sounds, they created complete audio environments. First, distant engine sounds, then closer engine sounds, then the squeak of treads, then soldiers shouting, then radio chatter. The whole illusion built gradually, the way a real unit would arrive in an area. Timing was everything. Start too early, and the Germans would have time to investigate. Start too late, and they wouldn't have time to react. The sweet spot was 36 to 48 hours before the real operation began. Radio deception was the most dangerous because it was the easiest to expose. The signal company special had to impersonate entire divisions over the airwaves. They studied how real units communicated. They learned the speech patterns of commanders. They memorized unit call signs, radio procedures, and message formats. Then they went on the air, pretending to be divisions that were 200 miles away from where they actually were. The Germans were listening constantly. Their signals intelligence was excellent. They knew how American divisions communicated. They knew the radio fingerprints, message frequency, encryption patterns, operator habits. One mistake, one inconsistency, and the deception would collapse. So the Ghost Army operators followed scripts written by intelligence officers who had studied captured German analysis reports. Every fake transmission was choreographed. The Ghost Army arrived in Europe in May 1944, landing in England just weeks before D-Day. Their first major operation was part of Operation Fortitude, the massive deception plan designed to convince Hitler that the invasion would hit Pas-de-Calais instead of Normandy. The Ghost Army set up in southeastern England, creating the visual signature of the 1st U.S. Army Group, or FUSAG, a fictional force of 11 divisions supposedly commanded by General George Patton. Patton's involvement was crucial. The Germans believed he was the best Allied general. They assumed he would lead the invasion. So Allied planners put him in command of FUSAG, a phantom army group. Patton played his role perfectly. He gave speeches in England, he visited the fake installations, he made sure he was seen. Meanwhile, the Ghost Army inflated hundreds of tanks, positioned fake landing craft along the coast, and broadcast radio traffic indicating massive preparations. German reconnaissance flights photographed it all. German listening posts intercepted the radio messages. German intelligence analyzed the data and concluded exactly what the Allies wanted them to conclude. Patton was preparing to invade at Calais. Even after the real landings at Normandy began on June 6th, Hitler held 15 divisions in reserve at Calais for weeks, convinced the Normandy landings were a diversion. Those 15 divisions never reinforced the German defenders in Normandy. The deception had worked. The Ghost Army crossed to France in July 1944 and began operating behind the actual front lines. Their missions followed a pattern. Real combat units would pull out of a sector. The Ghost Army would move in and impersonate them, making the Germans think the sector was still heavily defended. This allowed the real units to move to another part of the front without the Germans noticing the gap. Operation Elephant, conducted near Brest in August 1944, was a perfect example. The 2nd Armored Division was being redeployed. The Ghost Army moved into their positions at night, inflated an entire armored division worth of equipment, and started broadcasting radio traffic as if the 2nd Armored was still there. For 6 days, German artillery continued firing at the positions, wasting ammunition on rubber tanks. The real 2nd Armored Division was 90 miles away, preparing for an actual attack. The Germans never realized the switch had occurred, but the Ghost Army's work was dangerous. They operated close to the front lines, often within artillery range. The inflatable tanks drew fire. The sonic trucks broadcasting near German positions were priority targets. The radio operators transmitting fake messages could be located and shelled, and the Ghost Army had almost no real firepower to defend themselves. They had small arms, a few 50 caliber machine guns, and their wits. In September 1944, the Ghost Army conducted Operation Brest, one of their riskiest missions. The goal was to convince the Germans that two full divisions were preparing to assault the fortress city of Brest from the south, drawing defenders away from the actual assault coming from the north. The Ghost Army set up south of the city, within range of German artillery, and created the signature of a massive buildup. They inflated tanks in open fields where German observers could see them. They ran sonic programs at night, playing the sounds of tank formations moving into position. They broadcast radio traffic detailing supply deliveries, troop movements, and operational planning. They even set up fake command posts with lights burning late into the night, visible from German positions. The deception worked. German artillery hammered the southern positions. German reserves shifted south. The real assault from the north met lighter resistance. Brest fell on September 19th. The Ghost Army's most elaborate operation came in March 1945 during Operation Viersen, the crossing of the Rhine River. The plan required the Allies to cross the Rhine at multiple points simultaneously, but they needed to concentrate maximum force at the main crossing site near Viersen without the Germans realizing what was happening. The Ghost Army would create the illusion that the 9th Army was preparing to cross 10 miles south of the actual crossing point. The operation required every deception technique the Ghost Army had mastered. Visual, hundreds of inflatable tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces positioned as if preparing for a river crossing. Sonic, recordings of bridge-building equipment, engineer companies, and amphibious vehicles played continuously for 72 hours. Radio, fake message traffic from engineering battalions, artillery units, and headquarters staff coordinating a fictional assault, and special effects. Soldiers in the distance wearing distinctive 9th Army patches, walking around the fake staging areas so German spotters could identify the units through binoculars. The Ghost Army positioned their sonic trucks within 400 yards of the German lines, closer than they'd ever operated before. The sound of bridge construction equipment echoed across the river valley. German artillery started hitting the fake positions within hours. Intelligence reports confirmed the Germans were repositioning units to defend against the fictional southern crossing. Meanwhile, 10 miles north, the real 9th Army built actual bridges and crossed the Rhine against lighter resistance. Operation Viersen was a complete success, but the deception had a cost. During the Rhine operation, German artillery fire hit one of the sonic trucks. 3 soldiers were wounded. Throughout the war, the Ghost Army operated under constant threat. They were targets. And they couldn't shoot back because returning fire would give away their position and reveal they were not a real armored division. They had to sit quietly while German shells fell around their inflatable tanks. The soldiers of the Ghost Army lived in a strange psychological space. They were creating fiction in the middle of a real war. They inflated fake tanks while real tanks fought miles away. They played recordings of soldiers while real soldiers died. The cognitive dissonance was profound. Some soldiers struggled with it. They wanted to fight. Instead, they were performing. But many of the soldiers embraced the creative challenge. These were artists, designers, and engineers. War had given them an impossible canvas. Bill Blass, who would become a famous fashion designer after the war, was in the Ghost Army. Ellsworth Kelly, who would become one of America's most important abstract painters, served with them. Arthur Singer, a wildlife artist. Art Kane, a photographer. Harold Dahl, an architect. These men saw the war through a different lens. They were creating installations, performances, soundscapes. It was warfare as art. They sketched constantly. The Ghost Army soldiers documented their operations in hundreds of drawings and paintings. Some were tactical, diagrams showing how inflatables should be positioned. Others were personal, portraits of fellow soldiers, landscapes of war-torn France, studies of light and shadow across destroyed villages. This artwork remained classified for decades, but it provides an extraordinary visual record of the deception operations. The sonic deception evolved throughout the war. Early operations simply played recordings, but the engineers realized they could layer sounds to create specific tactical illusions. For Operation Koblenz in March 1945, they created an audio narrative. First, distant trucks arriving over several hours. Then, closer sounds of troops dismounting, equipment being unloaded, tents being erected. Then the sounds of a camp settling in for the night, generators, conversations, mess kits. Then quiet, as if soldiers were sleeping. Then, just before dawn, the sounds of an army waking up, engines starting, orders being shouted, tanks moving out. The entire evolution took 18 hours and convinced German observers that a full division had moved into the sector overnight. The radio deception became increasingly sophisticated. By late 1944, the signal company operators had developed distinct radio personalities for fictional commanders. They knew how Colonel Smith would phrase an order versus how Colonel Jones would. They created relationships between fictional units, referencing past operations that never happened, building a consistent fictional history. German intelligence officers listening to these transmissions had no reason to doubt them. The radio traffic sounded exactly like legitimate American military communications. One of the Ghost Army's techniques involved deliberate mistakes. Real radio operators sometimes made errors, wrong call signs, unclear messages, brief transmissions cut off mid-sentence. The Ghost Army replicated these mistakes. They created the texture of real military communications, including the imperfections. Too perfect radio discipline would have been suspicious. Sloppy, human, occasionally confused radio traffic was believable. The visual deception required constant maintenance. Inflatable tanks developed leaks. They had to be patched. Wind would knock them over. They had to be reinflated and repositioned. Rain would wash away painted shadows. They had to be repainted. And everything had to be done at night, under blackout conditions, because the deception couldn't be visible to Allied reconnaissance, only to German reconnaissance. The Ghost Army soldiers worked in darkness, maintaining an illusion that only their enemies were meant to see. As the war moved into Germany in early 1945, the Ghost Army's operations became more aggressive. They conducted Operation Bouzonville, creating the impression that the 6th Armored Division was positioned along the Luxembourg border when it was actually 50 miles away, preparing for a breakthrough. They conducted Operation Whipsaw, bouncing phantom divisions back and forth across sectors to convince the Germans that Allied forces were much larger than they actually were. Between June 1944 and May 1945, the Ghost Army conducted 21 major battlefield deceptions. They impersonated 13 different divisions. They operated in France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Germany. They were credited with saving an estimated 15,000 to 30,000 Allied lives by drawing German fire and attention away from real units. And their operations remained so secret that even other Allied units didn't know they existed. The security around the Ghost Army was absolute. Soldiers were forbidden from discussing their missions. Letters home were heavily censored. Even after operations ended, they couldn't talk about what they'd done. When they returned to the United States after the war, they were ordered to never discuss the Ghost Army. The equipment was destroyed or buried. The recordings were erased. The artwork was classified. For 50 years, the Ghost Army didn't officially exist. The silence was frustrating for the veterans. They had participated in one of the most creative military operations in history, and they couldn't tell anyone. Families didn't understand what their sons, brothers, and fathers had done in the war. Job interviewers heard vague descriptions of special operations and assumed the worst. Some Ghost Army veterans claimed they'd been in regular infantry units rather than try to explain the unexplainable. The first public acknowledgement came in 1985, when some of the Ghost Army records were declassified. A few veterans started speaking cautiously about their experiences. But it wasn't until 1996, when Rick Beyer began researching and documenting the Ghost Army story, that the full scope of the operations became known. Beyer tracked down surviving veterans, located classified documents, and assembled the first comprehensive history. In 2013, the Ghost Army veterans received official recognition. The U.S. Congress awarded them the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the highest civilian honors. By then, most of the 100 soldiers were gone. Only a few dozen remained alive to accept the medal. But the recognition mattered. Their service, their creativity, their courage under fire was finally acknowledged. The legacy of the Ghost Army extends beyond World War II. Modern military deception operations trace their lineage directly to the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. The principles they developed, visual, sonic, and electromagnetic deception used in combination became doctrine. Every major military power now maintains units dedicated to deception operations. The Ghost Army proved that in modern warfare, what the enemy thinks they see can be as important as what actually exists. The inflatable tanks themselves became iconic. After the war, a few were preserved in museums. They look absurd up close, obvious fakes. But placed in a field, photographed from 500 feet up by a reconnaissance aircraft using 1940s cameras, they're convincing. The Ghost Army understood the limitations of enemy intelligence gathering and exploited those limitations perfectly. The sonic deception technology influenced post-war development of psychological operations. The idea that sound could be weaponized, that audio could shape enemy behavior, led to decades of research into acoustic warfare. Modern militaries use sound for crowd control, area denial, and psychological pressure. The Ghost Army's sonic engineers were pioneers. But perhaps the most important legacy is philosophical. The Ghost Army demonstrated that warfare isn't only about firepower and mass. Intelligence, creativity, and deception matter. A small group of artists and engineers, armed with rubber tanks and sound trucks, achieved strategic effects that would have required entire divisions of real soldiers. They proved that in war, as in art, perception is reality. Several Ghost Army veterans went on to distinguished careers in art and design. Bill Blass became one of America's most successful fashion designers. Ellsworth Kelly's paintings hang in major museums worldwide. Art Kane photographed the most famous jazz musicians of the 20th century. Harold Dahl designed notable buildings. These men took the skills they learned creating battlefield deceptions and applied them to creating beauty. The transition from ghost soldiers to artists wasn't difficult. They'd always been both. Today, there are memorials to the Ghost Army. One stands in Luxembourg near the sites of several operations. The memorial features a bronze soldier holding an inflatable tank, a tribute to the absurdity and genius of the deception. Another memorial was unveiled in 2021 in Tennessee, near the site of their original training. And there are plans for a full museum dedicated to preserving their story, their artwork, and their legacy. The Ghost Army story raises profound questions about truth and deception in warfare. They lied, constantly and creatively, to enemy forces. They fabricated evidence. They created fictional realities, and by doing so, they saved lives. The ethical calculus is complex. Deception in war is as old as war itself, but the Ghost Army industrialized it, systematized it, turned it into repeatable doctrine. Some historians argue the Ghost Army's success depended on German overconfidence. The Germans expected the Allies to follow conventional military doctrine. They expected armies to look and sound a certain way. When they saw and heard what they expected, they believed it. The Ghost Army exploited those expectations ruthlessly. It was cognitive warfare before the term existed. The Ghost Army operated in a gray zone between combat and theater, between military operations and performance art. They were soldiers, but they fought with creativity rather than weapons. They were artists, but their canvas was the battlefield and their audience was the enemy. They existed in a unique space that has never quite been replicated. When the last Ghost Army veteran passes, the story will transition from living memory to history. But the documentation they left behind, the artwork, the recordings, the mission reports, ensures the story will survive. Future generations will study how 1,100 soldiers with inflatable tanks and sound trucks helped win World War II. And they'll understand that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a bomb or a bullet. Sometimes it's an idea, carefully crafted and perfectly executed. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure the Ghost Army doesn't disappear into silence. These soldiers deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.